Once upon a time, there were no drug laws in the United States. We had this strange idea back then that somehow this was a land of the free and you could do what you wanted with your own body. We got rid of that notion.
Once upon a time, we believed that prisons had the purpose of rehabilitating prisoners. That was the official ideology of the American correctional system. Correctional system, right? That word has an implication. Right? The notion of incarceration as the punishment was new and was American. We have 25% of the world's prisoners, even though we only have 5% of the world's population. We have more prisoners than China. Not more prisoners per capita, we have more prisoners than China. How do we get into this mess?
So the story goes like this.
The high point in crime in American history was in the 1820s and 30s, which is also coincident with a time when alcohol use was extremely high in the United States. America was a very hard-drinking country. Crime started going down before the Civil War.
From the end of the Civil War to the early 60s, American incarceration rates are, more or less even. They go up, they go down.
The rate of incarceration is roughly level at about 110 per 100,000 from 1920 to 1970. From the beginning of Prohibition, which we recognize was a lawless kind of time, the whole Roaring 20s, then the whole Depression, then during World War II, and with people being in the Army, the rate of incarceration is roughly level at about 110 per 100,000. Then into the post-war boom, into the stable 50s, into the turbulent 60s.
At which point the incarceration rate proceeds to quintuple. So we're now running at 740 prisoners per 100,000 population.
700 per 100,000. It's grown sevenfold, in 40 years. What explains a dramatic change in such a long-standing phenomenon? Why 1970? And my conclusion is 1970 is the conclusion of the Civil Rights Act, the Civil Rights Movement, and the beginning of the war on drugs.
But it's not as if we built those prisons for no reason. There was a genuine crime wave. I mean, you look at the crime statistics from 1962 to 1975, it's really scary. And I think part of the reason that liberalism has had a tough row to hoe in American politics is that the crime explosion was under our watch. People thought that the civil rights movement, would lead to, better things. But in fact, it correlated with an explosion in the crime rate, particularly black-on-black crime. And it, wasn't hard for people to draw the conclusion that this was not a successful experiment.
There was a need at a larger level for a system of repression as America went through a series of transformations between the 60s and the present.
You take a cornucopia of social problems and you scapegoat it onto one group or one issue or one substance, and you say, if we just got rid of them, everything would be wine and roses. And unfortunately, we've seen this played out over and over again in human history, right? The Holocaust, Stalin's craziness in his show trials and his purges, and that kind of paranoia that was generated because of it. Orwell writes very eloquently about that as well. McCarthyism. These are products of conspiracy thinking, false consensus, silencing opposition, and politically very useful. I mean, it's a great way of uniting people against a common enemy.
When you create outsiders, you create otherness, and that's space for fear. It's not that we're all being held at the same standard and therefore we have something in common, we're all on the same even keel. There is an otherness. And so where there's other, there's space to fear the difference. There's not an identity of what would I do if I had grown up in this circumstance or found myself in this circumstance. There's you are other, therefore whatever decision you made regardless of the circumstances was bad.
In the 1960s, it was the damn hippies that Nixon went after. He couldn't do it, he couldn't harass them because of the First Amendment for their speech or for their conduct, but you could go after them for the vices that were thought to be associated with that particular culture. LSD, marijuana. Ironically, LSD was used by all sorts of people, not just hippies.
If you can find a group that you want to remain outside, prevent from accessing the benefits of the system, then you have to identify conduct that they all engage in and criminalize that conduct. Well, that's fine when they're actually engaging in harmful, violent acts, but when all they're doing is ingesting substances into their own body, you need to criminalize that act. The problem is that a lot of people that aren't in those groups are also ingesting those substances. We're also smoking marijuana. We're also taking acid. We're also taking MDMA.
But again, it was singled out, one particular group, for social control. So the drug war has always been about social control in the United States.
Our drug policy is really based on fear. And I think that we want to hide the things that we don't want to look at. And we're afraid of addiction, and we're afraid of losing control. And so, people who are on drugs or who are addicted to drugs or who are out of control from alcohol or anything, we want to put them away. We put them in the psych wards, we put them in the state hospitals, we put them in the prisons. We warehouse them so we don't have to look at it, and so we don't have to deal with our own issues of need and our own sort of dissatisfaction with our lives and what we do to make ourselves feel better. I mean, the desire to alter your consciousness is really universal.
Back in the 1970s, early 1980s, I was one of the advocates for building more prisons. But like most of the people who were saying that back then, I now feel a little bit like the Sorcerer's Apprentice. Does this thing have an off switch? Because at this point, the suffering imposed by incarceration on the people incarcerated and on their families and their friends and on their neighbors and on their neighborhoods where their absence is now a major demographic fact. That suffering is now too big to ignore. Incarceration is now a social problem in its own right, comparable to crime.
So why this change? Why this shift after all these years? What happens is a response to the social movements of the late 1960s. It's April, Martin Luther King has just been killed. There's been riots all over the country. And Lyndon Johnson requests this bill. Congress passes it literally as DC is burning. And what this omnibus crime bill does is to redistribute money from the federal government to the state governments so that they may build up their criminal justice system, that they may increase the capacity and number of their police, that they may introduce computers, helicopters, SWAT teams, canine teams, that they may expand their prison systems, that they may harden their prison systems, that they may add maximum security in facilities.
The civil rights movement won, and segregation was no longer law, it was outlawed. It was prohibited to discriminate against blacks in employment, in housing, in transportation, in education, in all of these ways. This was, you have to understand, a genuine revolution in American society now.
Every sector of society is up in arms demanding redistribution of wealth, redistribution of political power, an end to the war in Vietnam, all sorts of things.
The first demonstration I went to in Washington was in 1967. In 1969, I was arrested inside the Pentagon, reading the names of dead GIs out of congressional record as part of a nonviolent religious protest of the war in Vietnam.
Nixon's analysis is that you have to understand, essentially it's a quote here, that the whole problem is the blacks, but you can't say that, so you need to do something else. You know, he wants there to be a wave of repression, but he doesn't want it to be seen as political repression. So they come up with a war on heroin, which targets the ghettos and primarily African American, Latino populations.
When we talk about the 60s, we're really talking about the 70s. Woodstock was the summer of 1969. You know, what we think of as the 60s really took place in the early 70s. The rise of festivals, you know, what we think of as hippies. Yes, there was the Summer of Love in San Francisco in 1967, but that was, you know, that was very early. You know, the war in Vietnam was still dragging on. The major protests were in the early 70s.
I was very, very opposed to the war in Vietnam. I mean, seriously, to the point of doing some fairly radical moves within the anti-war movement. A lot of the money from the Brotherhood of Light went to that, and it subsequently was funneled to the Weather Underground. So the government in the beginning used to think that the protest was funded by the communists. That was the official line. Well, they rapidly found out that it was actually coming from the drug sales of drugs. The anti-war movement itself was dope-smoking hippies. That's one of the reasons that Nixon upped the ante on all the drug laws.
It's in 1970 that the Uniform Controlled Substances Act is proposed by the National Conference of Commissioners on Uniform State Laws, and state legislatures very, very quickly then pass a Uniform Controlled Substances Act, all of which then leads to a dramatic increase in the prosecution of black people for drugs. So that today, when we think of the drug problem, crack, heroin, well, we think of black people. This is an urban problem. These are, what are we, code word for black people. Or I'll talk about, you know, the youth at risk we need to prevent from drug abuse. Youth at risk, code word, black people, young blacks using drugs.
I was in San Francisco from '65 on, except for the year I was in New Mexico, 9 months actually. So I've always been involved in that, whatever it is, that hotbed or that stew of radical politics and movements and people. It's my cup of tea, it's my people as far as I'm concerned.
I formed an equivalent to the Black Panther Party in the white community in Eugene in 1969 and 70 called the Patriot Party. What that did though is it got the attention of authorities, and as the Panthers were being cut up and shot down, some of the rest of us, including myself, were arrested on charges. I was arrested on a gun charge, essentially a gun that was not mine. It was in a car that was stopped by the police in the early morning hours. I was in the car, and I'm one of 6 people. I'm the only one that got charged with constructive possession of an illegal firearm. And I got 10 years for it. No prior convictions, no prior charges in my life. So pretty clearly, this was a political campaign to eliminate revolutionary culture.
Part of the broad law that was passed also provided for a national commission to study marijuana and drug abuse. In their report, which was adopted unanimously, bipartisan commission, recommended that marijuana be decriminalized in 1972, and warned about the creation of a drug war bureaucracy, was concerned about the crusade character, and felt, we need to recognize that the drugs are not as harmful as we're saying.
I say with some pride that the White Panther Party was ultimately characterized by Richard Nixon as the most dangerous radical group in America. Quite proud of that. Because see, nobody else had a rock and roll band. This is when we thought rock and roll, as I said at the time, was a weapon of cultural revolution. How wrong can a motherfucker be?
Crime and drugs are discussed heavily in moral terms. Who are these bad people doing bad things, and how do we appropriately punish them for that? Now, I don't want to lose that perspective. Crime is different from accident. As Justice Holmes said, even a dog knows the difference between being stumbled over and being kicked. Crime is not just something that happens to people. Crime is something that some people do to other people. And the victims of crime are right to resent that and right to demand retribution.
Some of the reason that these sorts of things come up in the first place is the criminalization of vice crimes, where it's nonviolent and there isn't a complaining witness. It's not a domestic violence situation. It's not a murder situation where there's a next of kin that's aggrieved and goes and reports it to the police, or a witness. There's no victim other than perhaps arguably the defendant himself. There's no one that's going to say, I was harmed and therefore I'm going to come report this to the police.
I want to make a distinction here, right? So there are people who talk about drug selling as a victimless crime. Tell that to the mother of the addict, right? I mean, tell that to the guy whose television got stolen to pay for the drugs that the drug seller was selling. Tell that to the guy who got shot in the crossfire when that drug seller was arguing with another drug seller. It doesn't look to me or to the neighborhood like a victimless crime.
What I found, and perhaps it was kind of through my own ignorance, but when I became a policeman, I realized, well, you know, there's a big drug tied to almost everything. You know, you'd catch these guys, you'd catch a person that, you know, been doing a string of liquor store robberies throughout Southern California, and we get our hands on him, and you find he's a crackhead. You do it to support his habit.
If you really want to take an honest look at what drugs are associated with crime, and any cop will tell you this, and any ER doc will tell you this, the number one drug that is causing the rapes and the suicides and the homicides and the aggression and the bar fights and the domestic violence, the number one drug that's involved with all these things is alcohol, alcohol, alcohol.
So a predatory crime like robbery, the victim runs away from the perpetrator. A transactional crime like drug dealing or prostitution, the other part of the transaction comes toward the seller. Right? So drug buyers and sellers congregate in street markets because the place to buy is where people are selling, the place to sell is where people are buying. The logic of enforcement is completely different in those two conditions. And yet our law enforcement discussion treats everything as an arrest.
And I made a lot of arrests, made a lot of drug arrests. And so it put me right into, you know, when you read about the drug war, I was at the front line. Just one little piece, tiny little spot on a map of the United States. I was out there on Graveyard for 4 of my 5 years, making arrests, and I wanted to be a productive police officer. And so I did. I made a lot of arrests.
You put a burglar in prison, you cut down on the number of burglaries in a strictly mechanical way. He's not doing the burglaries that he would have been doing. Unless he was part of a crew, nobody's doing his burglaries for him. Right? Burglary opportunities aren't scarce. Burglars don't compete with each other for apartments to break into. So there's nothing about taking a burglar off that brings a new burglar on. Drug dealing is just the other way. If I put a drug dealer in prison, I reduce the number of drug transactions by 0. Because his buyers will find other sellers. I've just created a niche for a new seller or for an existing seller to expand his business. But one way or another, that customer gets satisfied. So drug law enforcement starts out with a presumption of futility in a way that ordinary crime enforcement does not.
So as we sit here today, there's plenty of empirical evidence showing that since President Nixon coined the war on drugs in 1971, and we've spent $1 trillion, you can look back and now see, what have we gotten? It's been 40 years. What have we gotten from it? Addictions aren't lower. Prison population's much higher. The public tax burden is much higher to put these people in jail. I mean, you can put a PowerPoint presentation up and most people are going to see it. They're going to see, you're right, policy hasn't worked. The only argument is you can try and scare people and say it'd be worse. I don't think most people are going to buy it when you see pre-1970 to today.
Remove criminal consequences for possession of illicit substances. Doesn't matter what it's scheduled as, you're just possessing it. It's your body. If you're inside your house and you're possessing a substance, then your constitutional rights protect you, as the original drafters would have intended, because they themselves were doing things inside their homes that they did not wish the government that they were building to look into. There's a reason.
You talk to the older officers that trained me, and they would say, it used to be a felony to have a seed. So now it's an infraction, so you can't even go to jail really for under an ounce. But if you sell it to me, it's a felony for you. And I said to the kids of San Diego, I said, you have your ounce, but you have it in several different baggies, that's probably a felony. Cultivate it, felony. So it's like, if it's that benign, then let's be smart about it. The #1 cash crop in California today is marijuana. And the state is making very little money just through the medicinal marijuana dispensaries. That's where they're making some money. It's costing us money because we're still fighting it. The #2 cash crop is grapes. And California makes a fortune on grapes. A fortune. So, a state that needs money, failed drug policy, it seems like a pretty obvious solution to me.
It's not creating something new, it's removing something that's causing harm, is unconstitutional, and downright racist. It's a very simple project in my mind.
We shouldn't be cheerful about using punishment. But to respond to that by denying that crime's an issue is to give it as an issue to the sadists. And that was the history of American crime control. Now, the good news is we've gotten a lot smarter about how to do criminal justice. This is something that the public and the politicians and the press are completely unaware of. But policing is a much more intelligent activity now than it was in 1965, maybe not as much in Chicago as in other places. But a lot of places we're getting a lot smarter about how to do policing. So we could have a lot less crime and a lot less punishment than we have now, using techniques we've already developed. So that's my excitement. It's also my source of frustration that we're currently enduring a lot of completely avoidable suffering. The suffering of victimization, the suffering of crime avoidance costs, and the suffering of incarceration, because we're not doing some fairly commonsensical things that we already know how to do. The first introduction of incarceration as a punishment rather than just as a way to hold somebody pending trial, after which he would be fined or corporally punished or capitally punished. Right? The notion of incarceration as the punishment was new and was American. The Quakers introduced it in Pennsylvania in the 1830s. That's why de Tocqueville came to America. He wanted to study this brilliant new correctional reform that the Pennsylvanians had introduced. And their notion was to create a place where people would repent. And so they called the place a penitentiary. So that ideology goes way back. And what it ran into in the 1970s was social science. There were a bunch of studies of the rehabilitative effects of incarceration, and they mostly yielded very unimpressive results. Looked as if, on average, sending somebody to prison didn't actually reduce his future crime rate.
One of the fathers of sociology, Emile Durkheim, had sort of argued that in societies, all societies need deviance, and they need a certain amount of deviance, and you sort of look at that deviance and say, that's what's bad, that's what's wrong, and those of us who are not deviant, we are therefore defined as good. We know what the norms are. These are outside the norms.
The political system was happy to adopt as the meaning of that body of research, nothing works. So that got to be sort of the received point of view. Not what the studies actually said, but that's what people believed.
I was not even a man when I went to penitentiary. Everything I learned about life, about living, how to treat people, how to react, how to act, how to, look at the world, I looked through the eyes of a convict. Yeah, I grew up on the near west side of Chicago, the Humble Park neighborhood. You know, it was a lower working class neighborhood. It was a lot of city workers, I guess, a lot of factory workers, a lot of people that just did the grind day to day, so life wasn't particularly enjoyable. It was always one of those things where, like, this is a hard life, Every time it came out of everybody's mouth, this is a hard life, everybody's having a hard time. I got so used to hearing that shit that I started believing it. There was a recession every day. That's just how it was, I was a hardcore gang member. That's what I did. That's who I was. That's who I identified with. That doesn't mean that I was a person that didn't have empathy for others, that didn't care about other people, but I did know what I had to do to survive. And if you were going to get in my way, if it was between you and I, then you had to go. And that's just how it was. If I had to survive by making money by any means, then I did that. Whether it was dealing drugs, whether it was selling heroin, whether it was armed robbery, whether it was burglary, I was a jack of all trades. I didn't apply one particular type of crime. I don't think that's realistic, and that's all on TV where a guy does. Most career criminals are career criminals. They do what they have to do to make a dollar.
The count I got from one of the guys at the Marijuana Policy Project who did this fairly carefully, it's published in the Drug Policy Analysis Bulletin. We've got 2.4 million people behind bars. 500,000 of those are drug offenses. About 30,000 of those are cannabis offenses. And the psychedelics are close to zero. No, the mass incarceration is about heroin, cocaine, and meth. And so that's what we got to talk about.
How many people are released from prison every year? 750,000. Now we're looking at almost 8 million people on supervised release. That's under a form of correctional control. Those things and the problems associated with that are huge.
Let me first say that I by no means want to portray myself as some friggin' master criminal. I was a street level crook. That's how I survived. 99% of the people out there are street level crooks. I wasn't out stealing the Queen of England's diamonds, although I do know the guys that did. And those are the type of people that I was raised around. Did I come up against a lot of honest police officers? No, I came up against guys who wanted to be honest, but because of the forces around them weren't able to be. If anything, they were passive and dismissive with the things that, they saw and did. I know a lot of dirty cops, man. I know a lot of dirty cops, and let me tell you, we dealt with a lot of dirty cops as gang members that dealt drugs for us, that ran security for us on drug deals. There's a fine line between, the criminal and the police officer. And they always tell you a good cop's got to think like a crook, and that's true. And I don't want to sit here and say that everywhere cops are bad. In my experience, they weren't the best. And if you look at the record of, the Chicago Police Department, sometimes they're not. A lot of them are doing heavy time right now.
Well, if the purpose of incarceration was rehabilitation, and if incarceration didn't actually rehabilitate, then we should do less incarceration.
Okay, what you've got here is 27 prisons in Illinois, actually 28, but one is not occupied. That contains about 45,000 individuals. They were designed to hold 33,000. So, as you can tell, they're grossly overcrowded. They're beginning to bunk people in gyms and infirmaries and other places where you ordinarily would not have a person living. There is no solution to this problem that I know of. Certainly no political solution on the horizon. It's simply going to get worse. Every week sets a new record in the prison population in Illinois. And that is the principal problem that the prison system faces. There's too many people in prison that don't belong there, okay? 20% of the population in prison in this state is there for marijuana, okay? At the end of last year, we had 63 people in prison for disturbing the peace. Now, how do you go to prison for disturbing the peace? Okay? We've got people in prison for vehicle code violations, not drunk driving. It's just something was wrong with your car and you got a prison sentence for it. Okay?
When you're sentenced, like, it doesn't end. You know, like, I've been released. My sentence is up. I don't have parole anymore. But there's certain things that I will never be able to do, ever, regardless of what happened. So my sentence is not over. You know, my punishment is not up. I've created a better life for myself, being creative, and, you know, God forbid for the people who don't get that, who can't get that. But certain places I can never work. Certain crimes you commit, you can't even get funding to go to school. Like, you can't even get a grant or a loan for college if you have a drug charge. So, you know, where does it stop? Okay, then they talk about, you know, expungement and all that. Well, you can get it expunged, but it still shows up. So you go somewhere and you apply, and it says, oh, she did A, B, C, and D. You know, she committed all these crimes, but don't pay attention to them. They're expunged. It never ends.
You know, the drug offenders, in my opinion, and I'll tell you what I felt then, and I'll tell you what I felt now, and it's exactly the same. I did time with guys when I was 17 that I knew, as a 17-year-old boy, did not belong in this penitentiary, do not belong in this place. This guy has no place here. I had no qualms about doing time because I knew I did what I did, and I knew I belonged where I belonged. I earned that. And I don't want to say I earned it in a positive way, but that's what I had coming. And I was okay with that. The guy sitting next to me was a 17-year-old kid who got pinched with maybe an ounce of pot. And he's doing 2 years. Are you kidding? It took me a whole childhood to be raised in a way that assisted me in conforming with prison mentality. This kid doesn't stand a fucking chance. You know what I mean? Not only is he gonna get hurt in here, you're gonna turn loose a lunatic. You know, it took me a long time to get used to a lot of things, you know, and prison isn't the end of it. You know, prison's a mind fuck. It's 90%, 10%, 90% psychological, 10% physical. You know, physical stuff you can get past the next day. You heal up, the bruises go away. You know, the psychological part, I think, is what damns a lot of people for the rest of their life.
The high point of the marijuana epidemic in the United States is considered 1979. Through the 70s, more and more marijuana is becoming available. I mean, to give you an example, when I graduated from high school in 1967, nobody in my high school, with the exception of 2 kids out of 1,500, had ever tried marijuana. And I have a pretty good idea that that's very close to, you know, to the number. You know, that you just, you know, by the late 60s, it's all over American colleges. And by 1979, 1 out of 10 high school seniors is getting stoned every day.
This is what started the war on drugs, the second war on drugs. Parents freaked out. Now look, they had some governmental assistance in freaking out. There were a lot of officials who wanted that fact to be well known.
Every day. It was truly an epidemic, and people were freaking out. People, that is, parents were freaking out at their kids getting stoned all the time.
Criminal justice in its, you know, most basic level, it's about many things. You know, the law does many progressive and good things. The law is in many ways the last resort that the poor have to resist and face off against the rich. But another feature of the law is that manages and excludes and processes that section of the population which cannot find work. If that first moment of criminal justice buildup was about addressing the political challenges of the movements of the 1960s, then the second wave in the criminal justice buildup was very different. It begins again in the early 80s under Reagan. It's a war on drugs again, but the situation is now different.
When Reagan comes in, Reagan is really bringing in a very different gestalt, a very different national sense. America, number one. We're the best. We're the toughest. We're the meanest. We're the richest. We're the most fabulous. And cocaine is a drug that is perfect for that. You snort cocaine, you think, I'm the sexiest man alive. I'm the smartest broker on the street. I'm the fastest guard on the court. I'm the meanest back in the field. I mean, it becomes, a part of Wall Street, Hollywood, athletic celebrity. Snort some cocaine and wow, you're ready to go.
That second war on drugs, launched by Reagan in 83 and 84. 84 is when they have their first omnibus crime bill. They have like a major crime bill in 82, but it really takes hold in 84. That second round of federally sponsored, federally led criminal justice crackdown nationwide is not about counterinsurgency and repressing movements. It's about now managing the new inequality created by Reaganomics. And Reaganomics was itself a solution to the problem of too much economic justice, too much social democracy. The standard of living for American workers in the 70s was the highest it has ever been. But the economy wasn't growing fast enough and big business wasn't making enough of a return on its investments. That was the problem. In terms of actual life, it wasn't really a problem, but it was a problem for the logic of capitalism. So the solution is Reaganomics. Criminal justice buildup is an analog to that. So how in a free society, because it is a free society, how in a free society, it's a free society with full of repression, this and that, blah, 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 but it's like you're free to quit, you're free to sleep under a bridge, there's tons of freedom. You don't have to vote, you don't have to do this, you don't have to do anything. You don't have to have a job, you don't have a checking account, you don't have to have a credit card, you don't have to eat, you can just go out in the street and die. You're free to do essentially whatever it is you want, but if you want to stay alive, you have to work. So how is it that wages are kept down to a point where it's profitable for capitalists to invest? The primary mechanism is unemployment. So the system stops functioning if you don't have unemployment. So how does the system then, the culture essentially, then explain unemployment? You can't explain this the way I did. You can say, well, we actually have to have, always, even in the best of times, like 5% of the population can't have a job, because that's just the way it is, because then the other 95% of people would start demanding more money and there wouldn't be profits. You can't say that. So how is that situation explained? It's like, well, these people are lazy, they're bad, they're criminals, they're dangerous, they're unemployed because they come from bad families and there's a culture of poverty, blah, 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 blah. And the fact of the matter is, it's just structural, It's a game of musical chairs, There aren't enough chairs, there aren't enough jobs for everybody to have one. And some people are going to be left out. And that's when you get, the return of just mass open homelessness in American cities. And in response to that, to manage it physically and to explain it ideologically, Reagan launches a second war on drugs.
Hi, I'm Stephen Dubov, 82661-011. I'm 67 years old. I live at 701 Tillery, Austin, Texas. I was arrested in 1987 for possession of drugs. But that does not necessitate a life without parole sentence. That's just insane. But it was that time too. It was the anti-drug fervor of the 80s, end of the 80s, Nancy Reagan and all that. So I was swept up in that. And sentenced to life without parole, of which I served 16 and a half years before getting back into court and getting my sentence rescinded. In the 60s, actually, I was at Stanford in the master's program for sculpture, and I met Richard Alpert and Timothy Leary, and they were doing their experiment with creativity and got involved with LSD, and then with the Brotherhood of Light and a whole bunch of people. And I'm a sculptor, so I'm really comfortable with tools and machinery, and I'm inventive. So I got involved by making equipment. In the making of the equipment, I met a lot of people over the years. And when I was arrested, I think I was going to assume that what the government wanted from me was information. It was a funny arrest. That's the reason I got released. The drugs, I never touched the drugs. They were not my drugs. The drugs were brought into the building that I owned and left there by someone who was supposed to be a friend. And the next morning, the DEA and the San Francisco police and a whole bunch of officers arrived, and they let the guy go that was staying with the drugs at the house, and arrested me. And that was the last I saw of San Francisco. So the drugs were in my possession because under the law, possession, if you own the building and the drugs are in the building, they're yours.
How much were they talking about?
13 kilos of cocaine. So there it was. The minimum, with 10 kilos, anything above 10 kilos, they could give me life without parole. So they said they were going to give me life without parole, and they could mitigate that by cooperating, but I didn't really know what, I didn't do that. So I pled not guilty. I had a bad lawyer, of course, and I ended up going to prison. Okay, so I get life without parole, and now I'm in this compound, and I'm trying to, first there's the I don't believe this shit, then like, what the fuck, you know? It's like, then I'm furious. Who did this? How did this happen? And then it's like, this did happen, and I'm really unhappy. In the beginning, after about 2 years, I stopped thinking about drugs, or dreaming about them. They've been a part of my life for all that time, and it was just gone. I just never came to mind. After about 8 or 10 years, I stopped having dreams about women. Kind of made me feel bad, but it just didn't happen. But I still had dreams of eating bread. You know, like a real piece of bread, not one of those white wonder things, but, you know, a chunk of bread. And that, funny how that is, you know, how, what.
If this were crack cocaine, this would get you 10 years to life in prison, up to life. Now, the government doesn't actually have to have cocaine in a case. They don't have to actually see cocaine. If I were an informant and I said, Joe sold me 50 grams, or Joe sold me a kilo, that testimony is as good as powder on the table.
Common law system is a system based on individual responsibility. Our legal system is really not designed to deal with groups of organized offenders. And so we get these weird conspiracy law things. I'm not surprised that excessive things have happened as a result.
The other trouble is RICO. The way RICO, the racketeering, which was built in an attempt to bring down, massive gang organization, mobsters, etc., these long-lasting conspiracies. If you actually read the RICO, you can be charged with violating the RICO Act by conspiring to conspire, which means that you've agreed to agree. That's not actually agreeing, but that's it. Yeah, we'll talk later. That can be enough for some very harsh sentencing penalties.
I now live in the Tenderloin District of San Francisco. I've been living there for about a year now. Back in 1999, I was arrested for conspiracy to distribute LSD. I was given a mandatory minimum of 10 years based upon paperweight that was seized during the course of the investigation of the conspiracy. What that means is paperweight is treated as pure LSD crystal.
The person in Iowa who ended up connecting the dot back to California and Malachar was another very old friend of mine. And the emotional weight of imagining what it must have been like for him to have to sit down and think to himself, do I do extra time or do I give up my friend? And there's essentially this weighing of value of years in an individual's life, and are my years out more valuable than the liberty of my friend? And so it really tore me up from an emotional level that he was put in this situation where he was looking at a hellaciously large amount of time or a relatively short amount of time in exchange for his brother.
What they came to me with is, kid, we know you quit. We know this, we know that. We just want to know where you got it from. I said, don't care. I don't care. They said, kid, okay, sign this plea deal. It says you're a major trafficker, you used minors to traffic your shit, and you obstructed justice because you told the snitch not to snitch on you, and you're a leader organizer, and that's all true, and we're gonna be nice and give you 15.5 years. I looked at him, I said, but I didn't do that. I didn't do that. I said, we don't care. That's our offer. Okay, take that offer and shove it up your ass. Their next thing was, you don't understand. We're gonna get you for 20 guaranteed. And we're gonna go for life. Do what we call the right thing. You know what the right thing is. Just help us out. Don't be a prick. 4 years, you'll be out in 2. I guarantee you'll be out in 2, if that. I really don't care. Next line was, we will go for life. You can get the death penalty. The answer is fuck you. So I went to trial. I would have signed for something I did. What I was guilty of, if they didn't bother with all the other weird shit they were trying to allege, would have gotten me 5 years in prison. And I would have signed on the dotted line in an instant. Not because I believe it's right, but because at the very least I could say, yeah, that's actually what I did. Instead, they wanted to make this bubble bigger and bigger, basically, until I agreed to testify, which is why they agreed to the phone count, because they knew 4 or 5 years was, what normally would happen in a case like that, where they had more leads, but they didn't have any other leads. They had already got a drug dealer who was supplying locally. They had already gotten all these other players in Iowa, and they wanted somebody in California, and I was the only person fingered in California, and they knew I was getting it from somewhere, and that's what they wanted. They wanted a lab, and they figured with my nonchalance about supplying 2,000 hits every 3 months, which I didn't think was a big deal, but I guess in Iowa is some of the biggest shit on the planet. My nonchalance about it meant they thought I knew a cook. Whether I did or not is irrelevant, they thought I did.
I'm the president and founder of the Can Do Foundation, which is clemency for all nonviolent drug offenders, which I started when I got out of prison. Technically, I should still be in prison today because I was one of the lucky few that received clemency from President Clinton in 2000. Otherwise, I would be in prison until March of 2012. I was charged with conspiracy to manufacture, distribute, and import MDMA, otherwise known as ecstasy. And a lot of people don't understand that conspiracy doesn't mean that you manufactured, imported, or distributed. It just means that you were associated with somebody who was allegedly manufacturing, distributing, or importing. The day they busted into my home, they made it very clear to my attorney. They wanted my cooperation, and he explained it to me. Cooperation means you will wear a wire. They think you're a very valuable tool. You will infiltrate Sandy's organization and set people up. And that's what they wanted me to do from day one. I couldn't even fathom that this was possible in America. I didn't know that people could be forced. Otherwise, if you don't cooperate, we'll indict you for conspiracy, and then you're looking at 20 to life. So that's the blackmail tool that comes in.
Well, when I first got to prison, you know, I couldn't believe, I was still in shock. You know, how could I get 20 years when there were no drugs found and there was no corroborating evidence? The only evidence was one person who was looking at a life sentence saying, you know, that I had done this and this. This person had never met me before in life. She lived in Fort Worth, Texas. I lived in Orange County, California. All this information that she provided is what, you know, the judge used to sentence me. And because that was so wrong, you know, I just couldn't come to terms with it. I mean, I just couldn't believe that, you know, they do people like that, you know. And but once I started talking to other people, just about everybody there was, you know, at least for drugs, were sentenced the same way.
For 2 years, I was harassed. And the Department of Justice knows how to kind of run a steer right into the slaughterhouse. And they have come up with a set of criteria or whatever that they follow, which is to alienate you, to scare you, to follow you, and to just keep making your life so miserable that you will break. I mean, you will eventually break.
Under current drug policy, and you ready for this, and I got numbers to back this up, we employ more civilian informants than the Stasi in East Germany under Soviet rule. That's real. We, per capita in total numbers, have more blacks in prison than apartheid South Africa. Who are we? Who are we as a nation?
Through the rest of the Reagan and Daddy Bush era, you know, one crime bill after another. Clinton picks up the same baton and carries it, in many ways in response to the LA riots, and then when he's, you know, faces a Republican House and Senate, you know, he is trying to triangulate and pass legislation that will work. And so the Omnibus Crime Bill, the Anti-Terrorism and Effective Death Penalty Act, all these things are like his way of moving legislation through.
But in the heyday, the economic heyday, particularly through Clinton's years, we went from prison expansion to a prison industrial complex. And I watched that in 10 short years happen.
I got to see and deal with the influx of population, the growth. And so the prison system went from, federal prison system went from like 22 prisons to 64 prisons. And then that's not including the private prisons. You know, there'd be like 5 people would get released this weekend, 5 people would come in. And that was pretty much the way it went for years and years and years. Well, suddenly, 2 people are getting arrested, getting out, and 20 people are coming in. Well, they call them chains when they're bringing them in. are just, I mean, it's just every day there's more and more people.
Gosh, back in 1992, I held a press conference as a sitting judge, a very unusual thing to do, to state my opinion, clear opinion, that what we were doing with regard to our nation's drug policy simply was not working. We are churning low-level drug offenders through the system for no good purpose, ruining numbers of people's lives, including the family members and everything that go with it, really leading the world in the incarceration of our people. And here, I assure you, we're number one does not make me proud.
The media, which had for so long, like the New York Times and Ted Koppel, turned against the criminal justice buildup in the late 90s. They had supported it in the late 80s. 10 years earlier, they had been essentially riding shotgun with Rudy Giuliani, promoting the specter of the crack epidemic and the need to repress it with no matter what the cost at every level. And 10 years later, there really was an elite rethink. There was Ted Koppel did a series of really great documentaries about the overuse of incarceration. And the New York Times and other papers started editorializing against this stuff, whereas they had supported it earlier. But what interrupted all of that was 9/11.
The war on terror created a whole nother group of incarcerated individuals. The crackdown on immigration has caused a lot of but still in the federal system, over 50% are nonviolent drug offenders.
That third phase, I think, is purely political. If the first phase is about counterinsurgency, about repressing mass movements, the second phase is about managing the class, racial, and geographic polarization of the society and explaining away the inequality by blaming the victims and saying, oh, well, people in these neighborhoods are essentially just bad and need to have the cops sicked on them. The third phase is purely political in that it is about politicians posturing and not in any way serving the actual political economic needs of the system. So, in other words, I don't think American capitalism needs 2 million people in prison right now, but it has 2 million people in prison. And it has a political situation in which no politician can really reasonably argue against that without fearing that they might be called out as being weak.
We have 2.5 million prisoners and they all have family members. I wouldn't have known about the mass incarceration unless my own brother hadn't gone to prison. And that horrified me, the idea that something so big could happen and people not know. I was in my early 30s, not quite mid-30s, and my brother was arrested and charged with a drug conspiracy. And now we're both senior citizens. And he has about 3.5 years left, if all goes well, keeping good time and things like that. In lieu of maybe some major changes in the near future, he'll do that much more time. Right now we're in the November Coalition office, and it's a nonprofit that formed about 13 years ago in 1997, beginning of the year. And it formed because I was writing my brother. He's a prisoner of the drug war and was in a federal prison in Oxford, Wisconsin. And I had been sending into the prisons pictures of web pages and explaining the internet to an imprisoned person. And so my brother was sharing these missives with other prisoners, and they came up with the idea that maybe if the families could organize against the injustice of the drug war, and we could lend the prisoners' stories. Well, we put it to people this way: it's our government who should be ashamed, not us. And we need to tell what we're going through. And so then it developed into family members becoming speakers and organizing themselves in their community. We put up I think it was how to be a grassroots activist or something. And then we expanded it after a tour of all around the country to about 110 cities. Through that, we developed a guide to activism we call Bottoms Up. And that's when people started to actually, read and say, well, okay, I do this, and then I do this, and then I can do this, and I can have a meeting and put up a poster. We can decide what we want to work on locally. So now the activity of the November Coalition, when you say, what do you do? People do all kinds of things. Some people work on the problem of informants. Some groups work on their own community policing. Some groups work on sentencing law, particularly. We take part in any kind of drug reform in our region and anti-jail initiatives, and then we try to take our experiences collective with others and turn that into a guide so other people can do it too. In our state, people have to pay for court as part of your punishment, so you might get a $10,000, $15,000 fine, and then there's 12% interest that accrues. So if a person spends 5 years in prison with a $10,000 debt, by the time they get out, it might be $20,000. And then if they don't make regular, constant effort taking down their fines, they're out of compliance and going to be put in jail. That's part of the reason you're hearing a baby in the background. It's because a family with 6 children had the father taken into prison for non-compliance. And in the bad economy, there aren't any room in our shelters, and there isn't anyone who could take a woman with 6 children. So we did tell the agencies in town, and everyone can put their heads together and figure this one out. But if we're going to put the men in prison, who's going to take care of the children?
Mothers in Charge is a group of mothers, grandmothers, aunts, and sisters, most of whom have lost a son, a daughter, or loved one to violence. I founded the organization back in May of 2003 after the death of my son, Khalid. He was 24 years old. This is actually his graduation picture from University of Maryland. He was shot 7 times over a parking space on American Street in Philadelphia. And I said, I want to do something to make a difference with the issue of violence in our community. I think mothers can get together. So many of the mothers in our communities are suffering this awful pain and this tragedy of having to bury our sons and our daughters. And I think we need to try to make a difference. So last year we went into Riverside Prison, which is the only female correctional facility here in Philadelphia. So many of the women that were incarcerated were there because of drug charges. They were there, they were incarcerated sometimes up to 2-3 years. So many times when mothers especially are the head of households, because I guess maybe 70-80% of the households here in Philadelphia and across this country are headed by females. So when that female, that mom, goes away to prison, then oftentimes those children become the victims or perpetrators of violence.
I direct and am a teaching artist for the Free Right Jail Arts and Literacy Program, which serves youth who are incarcerated in the Cook County Juvenile Detention Center. And I was just reading a piece of writing that a student was doing a couple days ago, and he was chastising just the average Joe who gets all their information from the news media, and they would think that someone who deals drugs and who gets in violent conflicts with somebody else, that they're just a bunch of gangbangers who should be locked away forever. And a lot of the legislation follows that sentiment, plays on that, the average kind of fear. When this average person advocates for lock those people up and throw away the key, they don't have it in their head that most of those people are kids.
The reason why I'm doing this is to get the child's voice out, because children are affected by the drug war just like the grown-ups. And sometimes people think, oh, let's put the kids in a foster home, and then that's the last you hear of them. You don't really hear what really happened and the long-term effects and the PTSD and how it affects with being able to just deal with things, losing a parent and they go to prison or something like that. The first bad experience I ever had was when I was in kindergarten. And I had always grown up knowing that marijuana, I didn't know what it was. I just knew it was daddy's flowers. You know, that's it, it's daddy's flowers. And so I didn't think nothing of it. And I'm going to kindergarten and I'm sitting in the living room and with a fellow that was at our house, and all of a sudden we hear knock, 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 and boom, here comes the door flying open. And there was a jar of weed sitting on the couch, and you know, the guy grabbed it, threw it to my mom. She's like throwing it out the door and they're hiding it, and I'm like, I don't know what's going on. I run around the corner of the bar that we had in the house, and there they are in their all black SWAT uniforms, you know, full headgear, big machine guns, the dogs coming in. You know, they got my mom over here. I wasn't really paying attention to what they did to her because I was so focused on the fact that they had my dad. And they're like dragging him out the front door and slamming him down on the porch, and he's like crying and screaming.
But now I pulled my bootstraps up again, and I've pulled my family back together. I have an 8-year-old son at home. I have horses. I have a farm. My daughter's raised through what we went through. And I think it's made me a stronger person. I think it's given me, it was an anger at first, but now it's turned into more of, I really hope these people learn and understand what they're doing to people, because they're hurting some good people in this drug war that don't deserve this. They don't deserve this kind of torture in their lives, and the effect that it has on your kids, and having to move and losing everything, and over a plant. It's all over a plant. I don't understand it.
I started experimenting with. I started getting high when I was a very young kid. There was some stresses around the house. I was also dyslexic, and I think that then to be a dyslexic kid was kind of. I still am dyslexic. Was kind of heavy. Anyways, I started doing drugs because it felt good. And you know, the thing about it was that everyone was doing drugs, but only a few of us, only a certain percentage of us got caught up. And a lot of those people aren't alive. Some of us made it out, but a lot of those people aren't alive. Many of my dear, dear friends are dead and continue to die.
As a psychiatrist, when I look at our drug policy and I look at the way we do things, we're creating more problems than we're solving. And one of the biggest things that we're creating is shame and guilt. You know, because the drugs are illegal, we can't use them openly. We can't learn how to use them more healthfully. We can't teach our children how to use them more healthfully. You know, at least with alcohol, if you have a glass of wine at dinner and you model sort of moderation to your children, and they see that you can just have a few sips and not get so out of control, you know, we teach them like this is sort of a healthy way to do it. But with drugs, there's no teaching, there's hiding, you know, where like the parents are going down to the basement to smoke their pot and they're hiding it from their kids and they're lying, and the kids are going out with their friends to smoke pot and they're hiding it from their parents and they're lying. And the hiding and the lying creates a lot of shame and a lot of guilt, which is uncomfortable. And those feelings need to be quelled, and then we end up quelling those feelings with more drugs. So the hiding, the shame, creates compulsive use. It ends up creating an addiction, ends up creating problems. You know, there's a lot of adrenaline charge if you have to hide something, and anxiety and nervousness, and that ends up sort of adding to the excitement of the experience of taking drugs, and it ends up making the experience more reinforcing. You want to do it again and again because it's exciting. So, you know, the way that our drug policy is set up, it's turning us into addicts.
Growing up in the 70s in Detroit, you could see the shift that happened in first really in places like Detroit, and then is continuing to happen, the economic catastrophe and the social catastrophe that followed, including the effect of the drug wars.
But Detroit in 1967 was a boomtown. Detroit 1967, the auto companies were sending vans out to pick up homeless guys, you know, taking them to get their teeth fixed and bringing them on the assembly line because they just needed bodies on the assembly line. So it wasn't there wasn't economic opportunity in Detroit in 1967 as the crime rate exploded. Part of what happened is the people were spending that money they were making on heroin. And you got the first big drug explosion.
I really wanted to try heroin, man. I wanted to try it the first time I heard about it, first time I saw someone's older brother nodding out. I thought, that's for me, man. I didn't get to heroin until I was about 20, I guess.
If you put cookies up on a high shelf and you tell your kid, you can't have any of these cookies, that's all they want, and they're gonna figure out a way to get up there. But if you make the cookies available and the kid knows they can have them whenever they want, it's no big deal, they're here, you can have them, you can not have them, whatever. If if you're gonna eat a cookie, please do it after a meal, or please don't do it right before bed, or please brush your teeth afterwards. There's rules. We understand, these cookies aren't good for you, and we explain the situation, and there's teaching, and they don't hoard the cookies, and they don't, wait till you're out and eat all 20 and then throw up. If you have access to something and there's open discussion about it, and there's teaching and there's education, and this is something else our government is horrible at, is our government doesn't want to teach people what the drugs are, how they are used, what they're good for, what they're bad for, which ones are a little bit safer, how to make things safer. There's all this education that could happen.
I left Detroit, I guess 1981 or 82, came to New York to play music. And spent a lot of time bouncing around New York. If you want me to talk about my drug use, I can talk about that. The thing about growing up in the time that I grew up, especially in a place like Detroit, is everyone I knew of my generation, this is the post-60s, post-hippie generation, everyone I knew had some experience with drugs. And I mean everybody. All my peers had at least smoked pot or had dropped acid or taken coke. There were lots of cheap available drug. Quaaludes were around. There was also PCP was around. Cocaine and heroin. And heroin.
More than anything, our nation's drug problem is a public health issue. It's a social issue. It's an issue for the therapists and the psychiatrists and the medical doctors.
Look, man, my drug use became incredibly problematic, to say the least. Okay, I went from an active person, politically active, socially active, artistically active, to a man in his 40s living in his mother's basement, shooting dope and working all day long. My wife had died from endocarditis, which was contracted because she couldn't get a clean needle in the state that she was living in. So endocarditis is when you inject with a dirty needle, and it's an infection of the heart. She's a beautiful young woman. She died at, I think, 32 she was. And I was living, and so many of my friends had died, most as a result of this drug wars and prohibition, and some as a result of careless drug use, to be sure. A lot of them had been murdered, some had gone to prison, and this beautiful experiment that I had seen all around me, I believed that I had failed because I really thought that I was going to die.
And I began having a series of severe dental issues and pain, and I got a prescription for pain medication that I took as directed. I didn't even think, that this would possibly, re-addict me or be a problem. I mean, I took it to get rid of the pain. And I didn't like it even. It made me irritable. Sound bothered me. It was just not pleasant anymore. I go, wow, I don't even like this stuff anymore. But after about 5 days, one evening I was sitting on a couch and I felt this wave of opiated bliss fill my body, And I just thought, uh-oh. For me, addiction is like possession. That's probably the best analogy for me. That kind of hijacks your brain. And that's what I felt, Suddenly I was no longer a person interested in yoga. I was no longer interested in health. I was only interested in getting loaded. And I went about that in a very, very extreme way.
And there's a huge black market for all pharmaceutical products. I mean, they're really the biggest drug of abuse right now in America are, prescription medicines. Pain is notoriously undertreated in medicine because doctors are worried. The DEA is always looking over our shoulder. I mean, I have a prescription pad, and every pad has a serial number on it. And every time I write a prescription, not only does the DEA know what I write and the state of New York knows what I write, but Big Pharma knows what I write because they pay for the data. So I'll get a call from a drug rep telling me I need to prescribe more Ambien, and why am I prescribing Lunesta so much? Like, they know what I'm doing. So that's a little scary. So the doctors feel like there's somebody looking over their shoulder. Well, they're also, if they have this idea that they're going to turn somebody into an addict, so they're worried about giving somebody too much pain medicine. But they're really worried about their own licenses, and they're worried about losing their licenses somehow if they prescribe too much pain medicine to people. So there's a lot of sort of paranoia, I think, in the medical industry that, the government that doesn't really get it is, scrutinizing us too much.
Every doctor, whether they care to admit it or not, is dealing with addiction on a daily basis in their practice, whether they know it or not, or whether they care to admit it. But when you push a healthcare system into 6-minute visits and doctors are forced to prescribe pills rather than find out the source of illness or problems, addiction is just a very, an obvious and a likely outcome.
As a police officer, you're dealing with people with substance abuse, be it a domestic call, burglary, suspicious person. I mean, it's more than 50% of your time is dealing with that. And so towards the end of my career, and certainly after my career, it's something that, I've personally gone through some interventions with people. And I know the bad side effects to it. I've seen dead people because of it. The difficulty was when, going back to the rapport, somebody says to me, Kyle, I have a drug problem. Can you help me? Can you get me into rehab? I can't. There aren't really rehabs, there's jail. I can take you to jail.
Being a recovered drug addict, working with drug addicts, made it really clear to me that the drug war was a failure. That being on the front lines and seeing that these people who are coming through treatment, they weren't helped by prison. I know that there's some people that are going to tell you that prison's the best thing that ever happened to them, but there's other ways to help somebody.
Just a couple of weeks ago at a conference at American University Law School, a judge was speaking about the drug court that he has been the head of for 18 years, and he had said that even before that he had been, I guess, a prosecutor. And a woman stood up and said, aren't you concerned that you're punishing people who have the disease of addiction when they relapse and you send them to jail for several days? And he says, no, addiction is a lie, and it's necessary to get them to see their lie. This is not punishment. This is getting them to see reality. And in those words, I thought I heard someone who's really addicted to power and is in denial about it. That when a judge can't acknowledge that sending someone to jail is punishment, you're seeing someone who has lost track of who they are. They have power, and they're so used to exercising it, and to punish people, they can't even recognize it.
The question comes back to why. Why do so many people in the United States self-medicate? And people will always use mind-altering substances. Right? Going back to human history, as soon as humans learned to domesticate grain, right, fermentation came right afterwards. We've never been far removed from wanting to alter our consciousness in some way or another. But other societies have found different ways to ritualize or to incorporate these substances, including very powerful hallucinogens and other types of drugs, and use it in ways that are integrated, where there's very little evidence of abuse. So they had sacred control, they have different sets and settings, and we tend to take these things, as we take all sorts of things in the United States, out of context.
cognitive liberties to me, it does encompass a lot of things. We should be able to think what we want. We should be able to feel what we want. We obviously can express ourselves verbally how we wish. I believe that we should be able to choose our own medicines and how we take them. And I think cannabis is a good example. I mean, this is an age-old medicine. For thousands of years, this was a medicine, and doctors would give it to patients. And then when alcohol became legal, and there was this whole sort of machinery in place to keep prohibition going, they basically swapped alcohol for pot. They made cannabis illegal, and they turned it into marijuana. The 5 schedules we have for drugs. Schedule 1, which is where heroin, LSD, and cannabis reside. Schedule 1 says that there's no accepted medical use for this drug and that there's a high potential for abuse. You look at something like cigarettes or alcohol, and they meet criteria for Schedule 1. They're not medically used, and they have a high potential to be abused. They're not scheduled at all. You look at something like cannabis, it does have an accepted medical use. 14 states and the District of Columbia think that there is a medical use. Our federal government itself thinks it's a medical use and dispenses it as a medicine to certain people. And our government has a patent out on the use of it medicinally. And yet they're saying that there's no accepted medical use. There's a high potential for abuse. Cannabis has a lower potential for addiction than cigarettes, heroin, cocaine, alcohol. So it doesn't meet criteria for Schedule 1, and it really needs to be rescheduled, and the AMA has asked for the medicine to be rescheduled, and over the years people have asked also, but the whole way that drugs are scheduled in this country just doesn't make any sense, and I think it's much more political than medicinal.
So I had everything a young girl could want, I had the best weed in town, the best job in town. I was going to have a movie, I was going to have Atlantic Records. Jerry Wexler shook my hand, and 3 weeks later, John Belushi died. And I got blamed, because I was his weed girl. And they said the dope lady killed him. So that's when the lynch mob came for me. And that's when everybody went crazy looking for me all over the world, because I was the dope lady that killed John Belushi, but I wasn't there. The DEA busted my connection the day I was supposed to pick up some weed and bring it down to Hollywood to get John off the dope, and I was scheduled to be there that night. And that was before they had the Betty Ford Center, and they relied on the weed girl to do an angel job. It's called an angel job, And you sit there with your weed and the rock star or a very expensive hooker who's strung out on heroin. Now, they didn't have crack in those days. And you would sit there and get hired for a lot of money to sit in a hotel room, a couple bedrooms and a kitchen, and give them chicken broth and pot, and make sure that they don't die. And you know how to resuscitate them, you know how to do 911, which I do all those things because I'm responsible. So I was hired to angel John Belushi, but the weed got gone, and he overdosed. So I blame myself, but it's not me. I figured this out. It was his responsibility, but also the drug war is what killed John Belushi.
In 1995, Congressman Barney Franks introduced a bill in Congress that would allow for research into medical marijuana and its efficacy. And the federal government wouldn't provide any for it. NIDA wouldn't give them any for the study. It was to help AIDS patients. They wouldn't even let them import any for the study. And I just thought that was wrong. How could they study something if they couldn't have access to it? So I thought I'd hold a rally to educate the public that there was this type of legislation in Washington and that people needed to call their legislators. And when I did, it kind of ticked off the local cops. They didn't like it too good. They called in police from all over, different counties, different cities, all over the county, brought in cops, and they had the entire courthouse lawn surrounded with police officers, and everybody wanted to know, well, what do we do? What do we do? I says, well, you educate them. They need to know too. They're voters. So we held our rally, and the police officers here were taking pictures of people's tag numbers. and making notes of them being there. So we took pictures of the cops' tag numbers. We figured, you know, turnabout's fair play. So we took pictures of their tag numbers, and they decided they wasn't going to do that. And then they'd stand in the bushes and take pictures of us, so we'd stand in the bushes and take pictures of them. So it turned out not to be too good. The chief deputy told me not to do it again. And then 6 months later, when Social Security actually sent me the paperwork documenting that I was a medical patient, that I was allergic to all pharmaceutical drugs, and that I used a minimum of 3 to 5 grams of cannabis a day, I agreed to do an interview on TV, and I agreed to use cannabis in the interview. And when I did, it made the local cops mad again. So they came to the house and they arrested me, and they took our grow lights, and it turned out to be a lot of fun. Wound up getting the grow lights back, wound up writing a lawsuit and telling the county I was going to file it in federal court in Asheville. And they paid me $21,000 not to file suit. So I took that money and bought some pot, bought me a pound of pot, and I gave it to every patient I knew. And I said, well, Polk County paid for this. Y'all just have at it.
I joined the medical marijuana movement, the marijuana movement actually, the day I got beat up by the police for a pretty big sack of pot. I've been turned in by this dealer who wanted me to sleep with him, and I, of course, wouldn't. And so he turned me in, rats and bullies. You know? There was a squad of a multi-task force squad anticipating some huge house full of stuff, and when they didn't find that, they took it out on me and everything that I ever had. Oh, they bent my flute, you know? They punched holes in the drums. Everything, every single thing was damaged in the house, up and down, in and out, all the drawers, the food, the silverware, the refrigerator, turned over, everything. It was horrifying. And threw me in jail. And I was already pretty traumatized, you know, before that happened, and I suffered very much, this whole thing. And my father came out and got me, who we didn't have a very good relationship anyway, because he was an IRS federal agent who had thrown me out of the house for marijuana when I was 17. So he was very unhappy to come get me out of jail. But he was even more unhappy when he came to my house, which was a nice house, and saw how badly the police had damaged every single thing in the house.
It kind of makes an activist out of you when 3 helicopters land in your backyard and guys jump out with guns and destroy your place before your very eyes, all over a net full of plants. Felony agriculture. I had the opportunity in the autumn of 1991 to file a local ballot initiative in Santa Cruz County about medical marijuana. I'd used it since the early 80s for seizure disorder. After a head injury in a skiing accident in Lake Tahoe. In 1991, the federally funded camp helicopters landed in my backyard and took my marijuana plants. I figured I was going to be needing a lawyer, so I called my old friend Dennis Perone in San Francisco, who had been the Prince of Pot for the gay community for many years and had done a local San Francisco County medical marijuana initiative that autumn. It was on the ballot when I called him.
Dennis in '91, when I was in jail, I had worked on the petition for Dennis's very first, it was Measure P, to legalize marijuana or make it lowest possible priority in San Francisco. That was '91. And then Scott in Santa Cruz at the time was doing medical marijuana Measure A in Santa Cruz, which also passed that in '92. And because they were busting AIDS patients for pot in Marin County at the time, I got pretty upset, and I was going to do an initiative in Marin County to make them knock it off. And I contacted my supervisor and said, "What do you think about this?" His name is Gary Giacomini, very wonderful, respected man. And I said, "Lynette, you don't even do an initiative. Well, just pass this. Go to the Board of Supervisors. This is a no-brainer for Marin County. There's a bunch of old hippies here. They don't want to see AIDS patients going to jail." I said, "Really? You can just pass a law at the Board of Supervisors like this?" He said, "Well, it's not really a law. It's the lowest possible priority for enforcement and prosecution against patients who are using marijuana for medical purposes." So in 1992, we passed the Law of Shaw in Marin County, Ordinance number 3109, which was the first ordinance that was passed by political vote without an initiative to do something about medical marijuana, to downsize the criminality of marijuana when it comes to medical purposes. So they used this technique in several other areas in California after I discovered this was, a really nice way to go. It was cheap too. And you also learn how to work with politics. I had the only license to sell marijuana for 10 years in California. It was actually zoned and permitted through the municipal law process, through the planning commission process.
No one had to go to prison. That was always my goal, that we would be able to do this and do it in a way that would prevent that outcome. Even if we did end up in federal court, we believed what we were doing was a necessity, that there was no other option for the patients that we worked with but to use medical marijuana. There was no other safe option for them to obtain medical marijuana than to band together under the provisions of Proposition 215 and grow it for themselves.
I'm the lucky recipient of a lawsuit by Bill Clinton and Janet Reno, and they dragged me to court 43 times over 12 years, maybe more. I spent every penny that we could muster up. I can't, it's just, 50 grand a year in legal fees sometimes, to fight the case, because it was a technique that they were trying to shut down. The 3 clubs closed instantly. As soon as the feds sued them, they said, we're out. It was very intimidating to have the federal government drag you into court in front of this huge thing when all the major media and the marshals with their big guns and badges and dozens of them and everybody going crazy. And me, a few of my friends. And it went on and on and on and on and on and on and on. And I had agents assigned to me, starting from the Clinton administration, that followed me everywhere for 12 years.
Because if you're going to manufacture marijuana in America, you have to have a license to do so from the DEA. And cannabis is even on their little checklist of boxes. You can check the cannabis box if that's what you're going to be manufacturing. So we're committed to exploring every legal option for resolving our problem, so that we can maintain a claim of necessity. Because we applied for a DEA license to manufacture, they wouldn't give us one. Part of the doctrine of necessity says you have to have exhausted all other legal means to solve your problem. So every time we became aware of some legal means for solving the problem, whether it was a government program or a research project or a license that you need to have, we would file for that. We wanted to engage with the bureaucracy at all levels, because that was the only way we were going to get a true solution to the problem, get it in the hospital pharmacy, was if that bureaucratic mechanism was activated somehow. And so we used these various, we applied to be a 501c3 nonprofit foundation. And 8 years after we started that process, the last thing Bill Clinton did before he left office, probably the same day he was signing Rogers' annulment of his cocaine conviction, or whatever they call it, he signed the final revocation of our nonprofit status on January 17th, 3 days before he handed things over to George Bush. And so we tried everything to engage constructively with the government. And on October 25th, like I said, 6 weeks after 9/11, I guess they didn't have anything better to do. the DEA came. They were in our place for about 6 hours. It took them 6 hours to undo what had taken us 6 years to put in place. They kind of corralled us all into the sitting area of the club and dismantled everything. We heard from reliable sources inside the government that the decision to bust us came from the person right underneath Ashcroft. The number 2 guy at Justice made the decision that we should be closed. And once that decision had been issued, no matter how well the local DEA agents believed we were doing our job, and I think they believed we were doing it well, and they're even on record as saying that in court, they were under orders from Washington to close us. So we were closed.
My name is Julie Falco. I'm 45 years old, and I live here in Chicago, Illinois. And I've been living with multiple sclerosis, call that my profession, living and trying to maintain that, and as a medical cannabis advocate for the last 6 years during that time. In the beginning, talking about it, that was the thing of like, oh, do I say my full name? Well, you know, like, do I really tell people that I'm doing this and how to bake in it and everything? They're like, okay, right, I got to be concerned here of what I'm actually talking about, and you know, do I say I'm Julie F. or, you know, Julie Anonymous? You know, give myself a different title, and then right before, you know, there was a couple of interviews that I was going to give my name out or not. That's when I heard about Jonathan Magby in Washington, in that story that he had gotten arrested. He was paraplegic and could only use, you know, the chin-operated device to get around in his wheelchair. And he said to the judge, you know, I use this because it makes me feel better. And because he said that, this woman judge put him in jail for like 10 days. But since he was so, you know, he couldn't move anything, and he you know, he needed respiratory help. He, like in the evenings, he had to get put on different oxygen, he had to get respiratory help, he needed nurse care. They put him in a jail cell without the treatment or the care he needed. Subsequently, he died in prison. They left him because he couldn't, you know, I guess he kept ringing the, you know, or trying to bang on the jail bars, and I think they moved him to another cell that was farther away because there was no button or nothing that he could pop, you know, he couldn't even lift his hand to do that. And so when they found him, of course, he was soaked in his own urine because he had no care. Nobody says, here he is in jail. And I thought this was insane because I'm like reading the story going, shoot, I think I got it bad. I got my legs and I got my hands and I got my voice. This could be me. But it's like, here's somebody that, you know, is in a wheelchair and doesn't have that support he needed, and they threw him away like a piece of trash. So I said, screw that. I'm Julie Falco and I use cannabis, and it makes me feel better.
When I was an undergrad at Penn and I was studying psychopharmacology, I was studying the brain and drugs. I was very interested in learning as much as I could about how drugs affected behavior. But while I was an undergrad, a new drug came out that I'd never heard of, and it was in the magazines, and it turned out people were taking this drug called ecstasy, and they were dancing all night, and there was a push to make ecstasy illegal. And then all these psychiatrists and therapists started coming out of the woodwork and saying, actually, that party drug, I was giving it to my patients, and it was making our therapy sessions go deeper, and I was getting more work done with them, and it was really opening people up, and I was having very good therapeutic experiences. So they were using MDMA like a catalyst. You know, during the psychotherapy, the patient would be in this altered state where they were very trusting and relaxed and open, and they were able to really talk about their key issues and get down to the places where they needed to get to have some real psychotherapeutic work done. You know, the thing about therapy is it takes years, and it's a lot of peeling away the layers of the onion to get down to the thing that you really need to get to. And people are very defended against the things they really need to work on or talk about. And with MDMA, the defenses are really down tremendously, and people are open and comfortable enough to really get to their core issues and to do some really serious work and make changes and to change behavior, which is really hard to do. I mean, good therapy takes years before people start to change their behavior. But with MDMA, it's like a catalyst. It was going much faster and more efficient, and you know, people were saying that's like a couple years of therapy in a couple hours that you could really condense and get a lot of work done. So, you know, you'd think this would appeal to the insurance companies if nothing else, because they don't want to pay for years of therapy, right? Why not just pay for 1 or 2 sessions and then the person's all better?
One of the little narratives of the 1980s was those dastardly druggers were inventing chemicals that weren't yet illegal. And wasn't that a terrible thing? And some members of Congress got the idea of banning what they were calling designer drugs, new drugs that had not yet been invented. It was a very relatively unknown compound. DEA knew about it and proposed that it be scheduled. And some of the psychiatrists who were using it filed a petition under the law to schedule it in Schedule 3, where it would be scheduled like a legal drug that psychiatrists could use. And hearings actually started. Testimony was being gathered. And when we wrote the Emergency Scheduling Authority, this was for things that had not yet been, these were brand new things in our eyes. I was shocked that they used MDMA as the first thing. And I remember when they did it, it made I think it made the cover of Time magazine, ecstasy. And it was as though they were intending to advertise it to young people around America. Hey, there's a new drug called ecstasy. That doesn't sound so bad. I mean, it was crazy. If they had allowed the Schedule 3 process to go into effect, MDMA would have been used in psychotherapy, and it would have been a controlled drug. It would have been sold by illegal manufacturers, and they wouldn't have promoted it in the same way. They promoted it. They guaranteed that every dope dealer, hey, you got any of that ecstasy stuff? I heard about ecstasy. Where can I get my hands on that ecstasy stuff? They created demand.
So what happened when the drug became illegal is that none of the therapists could work with it anymore. But it was still available underground. It was still being made. People were still taking it at raves. Raves got more and more popular. They really peaked in popularity after it became illegal. But it's very hard to do research on a Schedule I drug, and especially a drug like ecstasy that has so much sort of baggage and misperceptions about it. So unfortunately what happens is you get a lot of people using it. You get a lot of drug substitution because people aren't necessarily taking MDMA when they buy a tablet of ecstasy. And we don't know enough about it because we can't really do much research on it, and we can't use it therapeutically, which is how it was originally designed. What I kept hearing over and over again from these therapists is that the patients who were benefiting most from the MDMA-assisted psychotherapy were people who had post-traumatic stress disorder, people who'd been traumatized, people who'd been raped or who had had some sort of violent crime perpetrated against them, and especially people who had PTSD from wars. They're in really rough shape right now, and you know, one of the things that I'm involved in now is helping I'm the medical monitor of a study where they're giving MDMA in the context of psychotherapy to these veterans of the Iraq and Afghan war who've got post-traumatic stress disorder. The thing about PTSD is that, you know, when people have been traumatized, they really close down, and they're protecting themselves. And with therapy, you need to be opened up to really get the work done. And with post-traumatic stress disorder, you need to debrief. You need to talk about what happened. You need to talk about the trauma. And you need to forgive yourself or the universe or your aggressor in order to sort of pick up the pieces and move on with your life. And there's something about MDMA that really does seem to help people accept their present circumstances and accept the past and forgive and move on.
So are veterans now these outsiders whose constitutional rights are in some way interfering with our ordered society? That seems to raise some significant issues, considering they've developed these issues as a result of defending our country with their body. Now we're saying that they don't have a right to their body?
I had known about Ibogaine for many, many years. This is the first time I ever heard it. It was probably 89 or 90 or something like that. I'm going way back, okay? While we had needles in our arms, he was telling me about this thing that he did called Ibogaine. And he told me, it was the first time I heard the word Ibogaine, Iboga, or Buiti, was when we were getting high. And he said that it was fucking amazing, that when he did it, he got like 6 months off of drugs. And he fell back into it. Anyway, so this stuck with me. This was sort of like folklore of the Lower East Side, Dana Beale's work. And if we can call that work, we can call it work. Dana Beale was out there, spreading the word. God bless him. I wouldn't be sitting here if it wasn't for Dana's madness. So they told me about it, and it stuck with me, and I heard more about it. I started to pursue it. I was turning 40. I was 39, and I just had it. I was really physically and emotionally, spiritually, completely spent. And so, through a lot of back and forth, I tried to sabotage it a few times, but we started the ball rolling, and my family somehow came up with the money, and my brother took me with me because they weren't going to give me $3,000 in cash to send me to Amsterdam. So he came with me. And because my plan was I was going to go to Amsterdam, and then from Amsterdam I was going to go to Greece, clean, and then I was going to go home and die. So I spent a month in Greece, and then I was going to go home and blow my brains out or whatever the hell I was going to do. So I got there and I took this. It was actually, I didn't take Ibogaine. I took a Boga extract actually, which is similar to Ibogaine. It's the plant medicine, and it was really difficult, but it wasn't kicking methadone difficult. To give you an idea, kicking methadone is the hardest, and when I mean kicking, I mean withdrawing, is the hardest withdrawing you can imagine. It lasts for months. It can last for months,
I've had enough of hiding underneath my covers. I'm done with all of that poop that brings me down, down, down. Don't bring me down, down, down. I'm sick and tired of being sick and tired. I'll laugh my whole way through the hurricanes and fire. That's why you don't want to bring me down. That's why you don't want to bring me down.
But the amazing thing is, after going through this struggle for 2 days, I guess, I came out, and on the third day, and this doesn't happen with everyone, but for me, I was just weeping with absolute joy, because when an opiate-dependent person in particular goes and consumes the sacrament of Iboga, and their withdrawals are either eliminated or greatly reduced, and they come out on the other side without the desire to use heroin. That, coupled with the euphoria that I was feeling just from the Iboga, I was exhausted. I could barely walk, but I just kept on saying, praise God, praise God. And I had a renewed faith in God, and I had no desire to use, and I was just absolutely stunned. And while I sat there, I knew what was coming. I knew this would come. I knew I'd be sitting with something like this on me, and something like that would be pointing at me, and someone like you would be talking to me. I knew this all was coming. I knew what was coming.
Tell us a bit about what happened.
Well, I just felt like I could do what I wanted. I didn't have anything hanging over me. I felt like I was free from the state's grasp, and that's when I was into the heroin and coke before I went to jail, but this is when I really got into it, and because I thought I could do it and be functioning, and that didn't work out for, God, it took a week and that failed, so I was just full-blown into it for a couple of years until I discovered Ibogaine, which was what really saved me. I mean, again, I've tried every avenue of detox and rehab and pay this one to $30,000 and you'll be, your kid will be clean. No, it just doesn't work. There's certain things that work and certain things that don't, and I've kind of been through them all. So I'm figuring them out slowly, but.
Man, I came back. I came back to Detroit. I didn't have anything. I didn't have a job, and I was going to save the world with a boga. You know, I still wanted to save people, which is, I don't even want to help people at this point, man, because I think those are both very dangerous things to try to do. Because the hierarchy, the power structure, taking the power away from an individual and saying, I'm here to help. I can walk with you. I can walk with you in solidarity. I can't help anything. And if you look, you know, we work on projects in Africa. We're trying to get a little project going with planting. I find myself saying it. I always try never to say, I'm here to help. I always tell them, I can't help you. It's a really bad history of folks going to Africa to help, you know? And I think that's a lot of this, the whole drug war thing. There's a really, look, man, the way prisons got set up, man, is Quakers trying to help. You know, they were really well-intentioned people. They were trying to help. Look what happened. It became about power, and it became about knowing.
That's whenever I set out to try to figure out what else I'd been lied to about. Because learning that society had just ingrained this into me on this substance right here, I wanted to see what else it had ingrained into me. So I did some more research into psychedelics. I read some books like PiCal and TiCal. I looked up information on acid, on LSD, because a friend of mine had an experience with it. One of the main websites they had discovered was Erowid.org. For those of you that don't know, Erowid.org is a website where you can collect experience reports about people that try all of these substances. And then it also integrates these experience reports with peer-reviewed journal articles on these substances and dosage information on all of these substances. So that's whenever I decided to take the leap of faith and drop a tab of LSD. It was an amazing experience. I was 19 years old. I was actually in college at the time. It was an amazing experience. It changed my world completely. It brought to mind who I was as a person and how I related to the rest of society. For me, the best way that I could describe it was that it took all of this intelligence that I felt like I had and all of these insights that I felt like were just lying latent below the surface in my brain and helped me bring them out. So I developed more as a person, and then afterwards, you know, I'd always been told that you drop acid 6 times and you're clinically insane. Well, I'm not clinically insane. I'd like to believe I've got a good head on my shoulders. And furthermore, I believe that nothing has done better for me for my sanity than my experiences with psychedelics.
I remember something my mother said early on to me, which was, she basically said, you are a hypocrite. Like, you've been parading around all these years saying, you know, eat healthy, you know, exercise and do yoga and all these things, and when all this time you've been poisoning your mind. And I couldn't even possibly begin to have this conversation with her at that point. But what went through my mind was, like, using psychedelic drugs in a certain manner has been so beneficial to my spiritual evolution, and I don't know if she would ever understand that, and I let that one go.
What MAPS is doing, trying to change laws within the medical community, making MDMA a prescription medicine, making psilocybin a prescription medicine, making marijuana a prescription medicine, will ultimately change how Americans and others across the world view drugs.
It was a couple of years of like having no place to live, and you know, I slept, you know, I had a home behind a dumpster for a while, you know, I slept in crawl spaces in hotels, you know, it was like pretty much just doing drugs, you know, all the time, you know, and doing whatever I had to you know, to get my drugs hustling, you know, things I regret, you know, and at one point I remember I found a house in Venice Beach, California, and it had been burnt, you know, and it was scheduled for demolition, you know, and so I snuck around it, and I was trying to find a place where I could break into the house, you know, And around back there, you know, it was like boarded up. I found my way in, and I remember crunching through like 6 inches of ashes, you know, through this house, and in the middle of the house there was a room, and I kicked this door open, or there was a door, and I kicked the door open, and I go in this door, and it's like there was one room in the middle of the whole house that was like not burnt, you know, and I ended up living there for like 3 months, and during the night, you know, I would go through the ashes, you know, and I would see what, you know, find stuff, you know. One night I was digging through the ashes, and like 6 inches under the ashes, I find something, and I pull it out, and it was a peacock feather. It was a peacock feather that, it was like a foot long, but it was like completely perfect condition. And you know, I was like, how could this be? You know, how could I find a feather in a house that was completely torched? And it was like it was a symbol of like that we're in a dream. Like this experience in life is a dream, you know, and anything is possible. And it was also what I took away from it was that, you know, no matter what happens to you in this world, you know, no matter how burnt, you know, you become, you know, there's a place, you know, at the center, you know, that you can go to that's, you know, maybe in your heart, you know, and that was what the room represented, and the feather was just, you know, there's something that you know, nothing can touch, you know.
In our culture, we tend to live in the moment. As a historian, I'll tell you the only thing that's inevitable is change. Right? If I were writing a book a century ago about the end of empires, people would have said, you're crazy. Empires are the way of the world. They'll always be with us. Within a generation, the major empires had fallen. That was neo-imperialism, but still, the empires had fallen. If I were writing a book about the civil rights movement in the 1940s or 50s, people would have said, you're crazy. You know, Jim Crow segregation, that's always going to be with us. Within a generation with the Civil Rights Act. If we were writing a book about women's suffrage at the turn of the century, turn of the 20th century, they said, no, this is, you know, forget it, that's pie in the sky. Within 2 decades, women had the right to vote. So the Berlin Wall coming down, caught the CIA off guard, right? The only thing that's inevitable is change, and sometimes it's even for the better. That's the lesson of history. And so I think the drug war it's an anomaly, it's a social experiment, and it's coming to an end. And when that tipping point happens, I think it'll happen rather quickly. And I think our politicians, though they're very terrified of this issue, are essentially herd animals. There's something even more that they're terrified about, which is being left out. And so when the herd begins to move, when the conventional wisdom begins to change, I think you'll see first a gradual and then a rapid stampede away.
In general, you want to be a politician, you got to tell people a story that resonates with their experience, which is one of exploitation and being screwed. You also can't run on being like, hey, it's a sunny day. Like, what's your problem? Like, that doesn't get you elected. It's like, you got to have solutions, right? Politicians have solutions. Well, solutions to what? You got to have problems. They're either the real problems, which are like racism, class exploitation, despoilation of the environment, sexism, all of these things, or you got to have some other set of problems that you have a solution for, which are invented, which are like that there's like, you know, Osama bin Laden is under some rock, you know, that there are like crackheads everywhere who are gonna like break into your house and like kill you or whatever it is, you know, like there's like enemies out there and I'm standing between you and them, right? So that I think is the main reason that there isn't a mass legalization of drugs. Is like, I mean, this is very functional politically.
The saner policy is for we as a democracy to shape the laws so that the police can enforce sane laws, not to blame them. You know, they're not the ones that I would say, you know, that they're doing what they're trained to do. They're doing what society asks them to do. The people that are violating the law, we all know. When I smoked weed in high school, I knew I was breaking the law. If I got busted for it, I'd have blamed myself. My dad certainly would have blamed me. So that said, the consequences you talk about are not good for society. And so the real issue is, it's not for the police to change it. It's for us as members of the democracy to look at the facts, to look at them as objectively as possible, to look at real world issues, both in the United States, where we repealed prohibition and what happened afterwards, and also in other countries that are first world countries like ours, and what has happened there.
Most people who do a significant amount of time in prison just want to forget about the experience. Even not a lot of time, they just want to forget about it and go on with their lives. Very rare you have people that want to deal with the issue that affect people in prison, want to go on rescue missions like myself to save people in prison, want to fight the laws that are wrong and should be changed. See, because of the budget crisis now, many states, like the state of California, 40,000 people mandated to be released. 67% of those incarcerated return within 3 years under the federal stats. So they're coming out less prepared into a society that's not ready to take them because there's no money to have programs to help these people.
I just talked to a brilliant guy from Penn who's doing his postdoctorate. Brilliant young guy. And he told me that, remember he said that addiction came about, the word addiction was starting to be used around 1905, just as urbanization was really starting to build up. It is a symptom of the modern era, which is the thing that none of these programs address. Once we start saying, let's look at drugs as a health issue instead of a criminal justice issue, I think we're stepping into dangerous territory, because most drug use, the vast majority of drug use, is neither. It's neither. When you break into someone's house, it's a criminal justice issue. When someone contracts HIV or hepatitis C or tuberculosis, it becomes a public health issue. But the rest is about what? Personal choice. And that's what gets scary to people. That's what the power structure does not want to have, including our well-meaning liberal friends.
You know, my dream is that there is some sort of universal drug scheduling that really makes sense. Let's have a really honest, accurate assessment of the risks and the harms and the dangers that are associated with these different drugs. And I also think that, you know, people need to out themselves a little bit about what their use is. I mean, you know, I feel a little bit like Harvey Milk, you know, with the gay rights issue, but I'm like, you guys aren't going to get your rights until you stand up and say you deserve them. You know, there's millions of pot smokers who are hiding, who aren't coming out and saying, you know what, I pay my taxes and I go to my PTA meetings and I also like to smoke pot sometimes. And, you know, I don't want to have to hide anymore.
Many of us, millions of us, are people who, you know, for marijuana has been a friend to us in our lives. Psychedelics have played an important role in our intellectual or spiritual development. And we can't stand the fact that we're being treated as criminals. But then we're also the people who have been, you know, seen the worst of drugs, people who have addiction running throughout our families, people who have lost a kid to an overdose, people who have, you know, have relatives in drug treatment, people who for whom marijuana was the gateway drug, which did lead to other drugs, right? People who really wish we could have a drug-free society, but who have come to the conclusion that we're never going to have a drug-free society, have come to the conclusion that the war on drugs did nothing to protect our loved ones or ourselves, and come to the conclusion that addiction is best handled as a health matter, not a criminal matter. We're the people who, you know, don't really see ourselves as drug users. I mean, maybe we have our coffee in the morning and a glass of wine in the evening, maybe our wife's on Prozac and our kids on Ritalin and our father's, you know, taking Viagra, you know, but we don't really see ourselves as drug users, right? But what we do care about is we care about the Bill of Rights. We care about preserving basic freedoms in America. We care about human rights, you know, around the world. We care about the devastation that's going on in Mexico with prohibition-related violence. We care about curtailing the powers of police and not turning America into a police state. We care about basic economic sense. We care about the government not throwing taxpayers' money down a sinkhole on a drug war that just can absorb unlimited amounts of money without accomplishing anything. We care about the racism and racial disproportionality that happens with the drug war. We care about about protecting basic privacies. We care about common sense. We care about grounding public policy in science and wisdom. We care about treating other drug addicts the same way we would want drug addiction treated if it was happening in our family. And so what the Drug Policy Alliance is, we are truly the people who love drugs, the people who hate drugs, and the people who don't give a damn about drugs, but who believe there's got to be a better way to deal with drugs in our society.
You know something? We're all on the same side of this question. We all want to reduce drug abuse and all the crime and misery that goes with it. We may have different views as to how to get there, but let's stop yelling at each other and let's just start putting our heads together and coming up with something that works. Because the war on drugs, literally, drug prohibition, is the biggest failed policy in the history of our country, second only to slavery. So we can't do anything worse than what we're doing today. Let's put our heads together and come up with something. It has to be better.
This is called Friday the 13th. Any day can be the lucky one, or the one with your number written all over it. 123 507. In the poet's case, walking out the front door of the penitentiary, 8:30 p.m., 39 years ago this December. 3 times 13 years, the cycle of struggle to make it through in one piece, on the yard or in these streets. Anyone who can pick up a frying pan owns death, Burroughs said. And sometime in New York City, coming home from the recording studio, walking up to his front door, John Lennon with a gun stuck in his face. Oh, oh, sweet giant of song, with heart of huge dimension and eyes deep in the sky. There has to be a day when each of us must pass beyond this tedious sphere to enter some wondrous place of which we do not know whether we're ready or not. Some other place or space out of time where no punk with a weapon will ever press you again or blow off your face out of the depths of his madness. No one will hold us against our will in a cell with bars in front and back, 6 feet by 4 feet by 8 feet high. No one will take us out of our natural lives and send us away from here by means of some murderous fantasy in which we are denied everything we have lived for. Oh, please let us die at the end of our own time and not before. free in our world of strife. Let us have life as long as we can. And please, let there be men like Monk and John Lennon to share their hearts and light up our ways as long as we may live. Man. Yeah. Thought that might contribute to the dialogue.
Wow. I'm just going to say wow.